What makes these saws called miter saws is that they are able to cut at an angle. That's how you adjust for an angle. However, I've been told that you will only be using the miter saws for straight cross cuts because the angle cuts are slightly more dangerous and we don't want you to have to do those. Let me just show you some of the components of the sliding compound miter saw. Right here, you have the handle with the trigger. That will start the blade, so be careful when you pull that trigger. Here's the blade guard. Never, ever, for any reason, will you need to lift this blade guard on your own. It will lift itself as you plunge into the cut. Here we have the saw deck. This is where you'll be placing your stock. This is the saw fence right here. And this is a clamp that will hold your stock if you need to keep your hands far away from the blade and the stock is very long, you'll be able to use this. There are some rollers here on this table we use to hold the stock in place. There's one on either side. And I believe for now, that's it. But let me tell you what makes this a sliding compound miter saw. Traditional miter saws that are fixed only have this action. Therefore, they're very limited in how deep they can cut. The sliding saw, however, allows you to come back and gives you a much larger profile to use for your cut. However, this does make it much more dangerous, because if you'll notice, the rotation of the blade is this way, which when you cut into your piece of wood, if something happens to bind the blade, it'll kick this back towards you, and that can be very dangerous, especially if your hands are in there. So the sliding saw is much more dangerous, and that's why we're going to focus on this for the safety video. All right, next we'd like to talk about how to make the cut. The first thing we're going to mention, and this is one of the things that we emphasize the most, is that your hand should never be, under any circumstances, within 6 inches of that blade when it's moving. To give you an idea of where 6 inches is, 6 inches from the blade is exactly where, on the table deck, this circular part comes to an end. This part that swivels. When you're turning the saw deck to make the angle, you'll notice that there's a circular part that allows that rotation to happen. Never should your hand be in that cylindrical area. Oftentimes, you're going to need to make a cut that's well within 6 inches. And you will be tempted to take this piece of wood, mark it, let's say 4 inches, square it up, and you're going to want to take and cut it right-handed with the short side in your left hand and your hand inside of that 6-inch cylinder. This is a serious no-no, and if we catch you doing this, we will kick you off the saw. Instead, a much safer alternative is to take a longer piece of wood, mark 4 inches from the end, squaring it up, now in this instance I will make a left-handed cut so that you can see it. Notice my hand is well within the 6-inch cylinder. I've got the piece of wood flat on the deck and flat against the fence, and I can plunge the saw on the cut, and my hand is further than 6 inches from the blade. This is how we'd prefer you to make these cuts. Next thing we'd like to discuss is the fact that the miter saw is neither a left-handed nor a right-handed tool. You can use it right-handed in this fashion, or you can use it left-handed in this fashion. What makes this confusing sometimes is that often you'll have to make a left-handed cut as a right-handed person. So sometimes you'll want to make the left-handed cut and hold your stock over here, or vice versa. Like, under no circumstances should you be crossing your arms under that saw blade. Okay, if you're making a left-handed cut, you should be holding with your right hand on the right side of the saw, not inside the cylinder. If you're making a right-handed cut, you should be holding with your left hand on the left side of the saw, again, not within the cylinder. So, if anybody is seen crossing their arms like this, or like this, to make the cut, you're off the saw. When making cuts on the miter saw, it's very important that you use only dimensional lumber. In other words, it has been cut on straight lines and planed so that it's not irregular and will sit nicely on the saw deck and against the fence. Many times you find that you'll get an irregular piece and it won't sit very well on the saw deck or up against the fence. These kind of cuts can be very dangerous because if you move them in the slightest bit during the cut, you will bind that saw blade and that saw will kick on you, and that can be very dangerous. So this piece of wood has a nice bend in it. If you're going to cut something with a bend in it, make sure you cut it with the cup upwards. That way you can hold it down on one side of the saw deck, and as you make the cut and the cut proceeds, the cutaway will actually fall away from the saw. If you put it down like this and you're holding this, and now you make your cut with the cup down, oftentimes what will happen is the blade will pinch and bind and the saw will kick on you. And you don't want to have that happen again. I'd like to emphasize that when you're making a cut, this piece of wood, the piece of lumber, should be firmly seated on the saw deck and up against the fence. It's very important because if it's not, and this moves in the slightest manner, again, that saw blade could get pinched and that's a bad thing. So, oftentimes you'll want to use clamps, especially when cutting longer stock. In this case, when you're cutting something kind of long, it may hang off the roller such a way that it wants to seesaw like this. And that action, can be uncomfortable. So instead of stressing yourself out or putting yourself in a dangerous situation, just clamp the piece of wood down. And then you won't need your hands at all. Okay, so we'll get that firmly seated. Down there. Hands free, right? So, I'll show you how to make the cut here. Put my ear protection in. Right, when you're making this cut, this is a sliding saw. So what you don't want to do is just come right down on the piece of wood. Rather, you'd want to come to it from in front of the wood. So when you're making your cut, you come down, come in front of the wood, and then push into the wood firmly but slowly. If you go in there too fast, you could just destroy the wood, destroy the blade, kick the blade. So just be firm and slow and secure. When you're starting the saw, it'll want to give you a little kick because it's a pretty powerful saw. So that blade's got torque on it. So make sure you hold this firmly. And keep the saw in the saw deck until it stops, and then you can finally lift up. We do want to give you a word of caution about clamping though. Yes, it's a good idea, but it's a really bad idea to clamp on the wrong side of the wood. Right here, this is an example of what you never want to do. You never want to constrain the cutaway. Okay, so say you're clamping there, and you're holding here, and this is what you want to be cut away. This is very bad. What can happen is, if this is confined, and you try to cut this, that can pinch the blade and cause another kickback. Don't want to have that happen. So, always leave the cutaway free. I'm making a left-handed cut. My hand is outside the cylinder, although I do not have my ear protection in. I'll show you one more time how to make a cut. Remember, keep that saw blade in the saw deck until it's completely stopped before you bring the saw up. There you have it. Okay, last thing we'd like to do today is to show you how to make a proper mark on your lumber and to make sure that you are cutting on the right side of the saw blade so that you don't cut your stock too short. Say you want to cut a piece 6 inches long. First thing I do is, if it's a new piece of lumber, I always check to make sure the end is square. And that's decent, it's not perfect. If you look, there's a sticker here, so sometimes there's staples in there. You definitely want to make sure there's no staple in there. So take a look, there is no staple there either. So that should be fine. All right, say we want to mark this 6 inches. What I do is I like to draw an arrow where the point is right at 6 inches. And hopefully we'll get you to see that arrow right there. And then what I do, so this point right here is at 6 inches. So what I do is I'll square that up. That'll make it easy for me to see all along this piece of wood where the saw blade is going to interact with that. Okay, if you're making a right-handed cut and you've marked on the right-hand side of your piece of wood, you kind of have to look across the saw blade to see if you're getting it right. So what you do, make sure it's seated properly up against the fence and down on the saw deck. And then you want to bring the saw down and make sure that you're cutting on the left side of that mark. Okay, I've got it lined up. And, oops. Let's check it for 6 inches. Right on the money. Now, if I had cut on the right side of that line so that I could actually see it from the left side of the blade, I would have cut this 1/8 inch too short, because the blade is about 1/8 of an inch. So always just be aware of what side of the line you're cutting on and what right-handed or left-handed cut, what kind of cut you need to make in order to make it easier for yourself. Okay, and that's it.